Hi, Noam.
Hey, Megan, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm well. Good to do this with you.
Yes, I'm a longtime fan. So, and I actually think I used to work with a friend of yours
Yes.
from Tulane.
Lane Green, The Economist.
Yes, who speaks very well of you always.
Likewise, yeah, I speak well of you.
Oh, that's good to hear.
And I'm a fan of yours as well, so it works out quite well.
It's just like a big love fest.
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, let's start off. It's been a busy week for economics journalists.
It has.
And bloggers. So, what do you think was the biggest development last week?
So it's a bit of a loaded question. Well, one of the most intriguing things, maybe we should just start out with this because I think it's happened late in the week and it was intriguing. We can maybe come back to the G20 later if you want to. But this Philip Swagel presentation at Brookings, he wrote, was a former assistant secretary for economic policy in the Bush Treasury Department in the final years under Paulson, came out with a big paper that's getting a lot of attention on the economics blogosphere. And you actually went to hear his presentation at Brookings. So maybe you, if you could just tell us sort of your impressions of the paper and his presentation, and we can chat a bit about that.
I mean, we can sort of sum it up by saying that his response, what the paper was written in response to, is the large number of economists who are not merely putting forward alternative plans for Treasury to consider, but who are excoriating everything Treasury has done and saying, how could they be so foolish? Why are they doing this moronic thing? And I think you could summarize his response as, well, there's these little things we like to call rules, and we had to follow them. They have a lot of legal and regulatory constraints that didn't let them just say, do what Luigi Zingales suggested,
right.
and push all these firms into bankruptcy or whatever. They don't have the authority to do it. They have a completely recalcitrant Congress that gets more recalcitrant every day, in large part because of the political pressure that they're getting from their constituents. Right. And given that, the economists at Treasury were first of all being swept, by events. That this stuff was happening so quickly that they did what they thought they could do. In the legal and regulatory context that they had, and that wasn't what they would have preferred to do. It was just the only thing that they were allowed to do.
Right.
I would say that's the 1 minute summary.
Right. No, I thought it was interesting. I haven't read the paper itself. I've read some of the summaries, not the oral 1 minute versions, but I did think it was interesting that he sort of lent credence to this claim that you hear Geithner make a lot, and he made it when he was on the Hill a week or two ago asking for more authority to seize non-bank financial institutions like AIG, that they basically didn't have a lot of great choices there because their regulatory power was very limited. So they kind of had to do this sort of jerry-rigged, loan kind of situation that wasn't, their ideal fix, but they just didn't feel like they could seize AIG because there's no FDIC for insurance companies that allows you to do that. In fact, they're regulated by this 50-state patchwork. It's very complicated. So it was interesting that he sort of lent credence to this big Geithner complaint, which he was going to Congress to try to fix. The other thing I thought was interesting, and it kind of runs right up into this question of what they could do or what they couldn't do, is, he sort of, again, if the summaries that I read were accurate and they quoted from him, so it seemed accurate, though it's possible that they could have quoted him out of context, is, he did seem to suggest that letting Lehman fail was a mistake, and it's not clear what they could have done about it because they were limited as to what they could do, but he did seem to suggest that they were surprised at the market reaction, both in the money markets, I guess, which had invested more heavily in Lehman debt than they had realized, Lehman commercial paper, I guess, and in just the general sort of global financial panic that ensued as a result. And it's sort of consistent with other accounts. I remember this Wall Street Journal piece, the first kind of definitive, reconstruction of what happened. And it did seem to suggest, I remember there was a very vivid quote that they had, that Geithner had said, which was, he sort of thought they could try to contain the damage, and he kind of morbidly said that he was spreading foam on the runway to cushion the collapse, or the crash, I guess. And that sort of seemed to imply that he felt that, okay, this is going to be ugly, but they could sort of contain the damage, when in fact it was a real it was a real problem for the financial markets, and we can debate whether it was a sort of proximate cause or an actual cause, but it did lead to the markets kind of going haywire for a while. So I don't have a great answer, but he on the one hand seems to suggest, well, they were really limited in what they could do. On the other hand, also seems to suggest that they were really surprised, actually, surprised at how at the fallout from this, and maybe they would have tried to do something more aggressive.
Well, here's this interesting question. There's two things I want to say about that, and the first is to what you just said. There's a really interesting thing about when we talked about 9/11, and obviously, like, Republicans like to claim that Clinton should have prevented it, and Democrats had this ridiculous PowerPoint slide that Bush had gotten, presumably one among thousands of equally devastating PowerPoint slides on the subject of Al-Qaeda, and said, like, why they should have done something. Like, this is a clear failure of their leadership. But if you actually go back and, talk to people who do that kind of security stuff, they say, what were we going to do that we would have had the legal authority to do before 9/11 happened? When you shut down all the airports, you're going to tell people, well, there's this threat. I'm going to shut down all the airports. Or I'm going to strip search everyone. Or I'm going to do whatever, right? There's no way that they would have gotten the authority to do it before the attack had happened. And similarly, I think that it's totally true that, and in fact, Treasury, like, at least according to Swiegel's account, and I think others, Treasury wanted to do more. They wanted to have money on hand to deal with stuff like this. But until something really bad happened, there was no way they were going to get congressional authority to do it. They couldn't get the money until the point where Paulson and Bernanke could go to Congress and say, the sky is falling, the world is ending, the four horsemen are saddled up and ready to go, you must give me $500 billion now. And had they had a smaller amount 5 months earlier, maybe, this is counterfactual, maybe they could have prevented a lot of this. But they didn't, and there was no political way they were going to get it, because preventing something that hasn't happened yet is really, really difficult. It's expensive, and the best thing that happens, right, is you get the money, you prevent it, and then everyone's like, you wasted all this money. The second thing is that, and this, I don't know what you're hearing from the people that you talk to in, like, on the official side, but the sense that I have is that they didn't see Lehman coming. That the Fed and Treasury both thought, like, they did Bear Stearns. They got huge political pushback, just absolutely catastrophic political pushback. And they were also really worried, as they should have been, about moral hazard, which for our readers who are not economic geeks is just the idea that if you buy insurance, you're less worried about a risk for it, right? So you insure your house against fire, maybe you're not quite so careful with the stove. You have really good car insurance, you're not so careful about accidents. And if you've ever driven while uninsured, you know that, like, you drive 2 miles an hour, you're very careful because you can't get into an accident. I should clarify, I've done this for exactly 2 hours, waiting for insurance to kick in after I bought a car, but boy, I sat near that car for 2 hours. But so what policymakers are really worried about, right, is that if they make it so that bad things won't happen to banks, then banks will have more incentive to take risk. And so there were these twin things of A, the political fallout, B, the Fed was really worried about compromising its role as sort of a neutral arbiter who doesn't pick winners and so forth, and C, that they were really worried that the political stuff, they're also worried about the moral hazard that they created. So they decided that they were going to let Lehman fail. And I don't think they're saying that now, but you kind of, like, would they say stuff defending it that makes it clear that that's what happened, and they now have to claim they really couldn't save. They decided they were going to let Lehman fail. And they prepared for it because they saw it coming and they knew it was going to happen for months. They didn't necessarily know it would be Lehman, but they were pretty sure that another major investment bank was going to fail, and they decided to let it fail pour encourager les autres, right? With my horrible high school French accent. So what happened was that they had prepared for everything they could think of that could possibly go wrong, right? Things like the repo market and what they were going to do about a broker-dealer failing and all the rest of it. And they totally just missed the money markets. They totally missed that 1/3 of the commercial paper market at this point was financial paper. and that there was a really big risk that a money market fund was going to go bust, as in fact one did, and that caused not only a run on the money market but on general financial debt, and it was a disaster. And that has just scared the bejesus out of them, and they're now determined that they're not going to do anything that has that kind of global catastrophic outcome, because in fact, like, they then, if you think about, we didn't have a catastrophe, but you think about what they had to do to prevent a catastrophe. They had to get Merrill Lynch sold off. They had to backstop every money market mutual fund, guarantee, go in and guarantee all this new debt. They don't want to be in that position again, of, especially when the next time it happens, maybe there's no way for them to prevent the run. So they're now not going to let a bank fail, is the sense that I get, which means that, there is moral hazard in the market, but the alternatives may be worse. And I think that that's an uncomfortable position for Treasury people to be in. I don't know, is that basically what you're hearing? Or?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say a couple things. One, yeah, they didn't anticipate the effects in the commercial paper market, which obviously impacts money market funds quite a bit. Two, they just didn't anticipate sort of general psychological impact. I mean, the credit default swaps, for example, which ended up being AIG's undoing. I mean, that Lehman's failure sent the credit default swap market into haywire, which, there were all these sort of residual effects that they just couldn't be gamed out in advance. Two, yeah, I think you're exactly right. A source of mine, a very smart money manager type, not long after it happened, told me and made a very similar point to what you're making, which is, look, they thought that they were going to solve the moral hazard problem here, saying, look, we're not going to bail. Lehman was going to be the great example. What happens when you take on too much risk and you collapse under the weight of it. But in fact, they did the reverse. I mean, they basically said they said that Lehman was so catastrophic, and the political effects, to say nothing about the financial market effects, were so bad that no future regulator is going to want another Lehman on their watch. It's just not going to happen. No one wants to face the fallout from that. And so they've just ensured that every future generation of regulator, whether you're at the Fed or, all over, the Office of Thrift Supervision, whatever it is, you are not going to want another Lehman on your watch. This is going to be seared into the memory of every regulator that comes from, for generations forward. And so I think you're absolutely right. They did the exact opposite of solve a moral hazard problem by letting it fail. I mean, I think, Brad DeLong, economist, blogger, former Treasury official, I think has a sort of way of thinking about this that I think is sort of the best we can do in the sort of global interconnected financial age that we live in, which is you have to basically assure markets that you're going to come to rescue an institution that's too big to fail, but you have to also assure them that you're going to make it incredibly painful for them. Certainly shareholders are going to get wiped out. Bondholders probably have to take a haircut. Whatever it is, you have to basically say, we're not going to let this fail, so it's not going to melt down the global financial markets, but it's going to be really painful, so it's not something that you want to do. You don't want us to come in and save your firm because it's not going to feel very good. And I think, as long as we're sort of, we have, the reality is that we have these firms that are so large and interconnected that we can't let them fail. I think that may be the best you can do.
So how do you think we're doing on that scale? On
institutions that are too big to fail, or just managing the bailouts?
On making them. I mean, I think the institutions that are too big to fail, I'm of two minds on this, because on the one hand, it makes intuitive sense, right? We just need to sweat these things down to size. But when you think that Lehman wasn't really the biggest investment bank, it was no Citibank, and it was too big to fail. Too big to fail is really a matter not of size or anything that's easy to talk about. It's a matter of how tightly intercoupled are you with the rest of the system. And that's a really, how do you establish a regulatory standard for that? Don't become too vital. I think that but how do you think we're doing? Are our regulators moving in the right direction? Or are they moving in the wrong direction?
It's a good question. I mean, I do think you're right. Too big to fail is a pretty crude way of thinking. Just size of your balance sheet is too crude a way to think about it. I guess I am somewhat discomfited by the fact that we are sort of reconciling ourselves to the fact that we can't do anything structurally. Geithner is proposing, the administration is proposing a systemic risk regulator. which basically, reconciles it to the structure of the marketplace and just tries to sort of preempt, risks that could melt everything down, which seems like a really tall order to me. As you say, just in the context of Lehman, they missed so many things that, they didn't think it was as systemically important as it was, and in fact it was. So the idea that we're going to have this sort of uber regulator that susses out systemic risks before they happen, it does seem like slightly pie in the sky to me, and I think you probably do need some more structural fixes. Having said that, I'm not sure you need them like right at this moment. It's not like financial institutions are selling a whole bunch of like risky derivatives products now, and basically leveraging themselves, very aggressively. So I don't quite understand the sense of urgency from a substantive perspective. I mean, politically, maybe it's important because you want private capital to come in and just the public generally to have confidence in the financial system, and maybe that won't happen until there's a certain sort of, A, rules of the game to prevent this from happening in the future, and B, from the perspective of private capital, just they want to know what the terms are going to be in the future. So just the sort of regulatory uncertainty kind of needs to be resolved before you'll get a lot of private investment going forward.
Well, I think that's the big thing, and sort of a corollary to that is that if you're going to rebuild a stronger, safer financial system, you want it to start out growing along the lines that you want it as soon as possible, right? Because we've learned to our peril how hard all of this stuff is to undo, so we don't want to do any more of it. But I do think it exposes this irony that the best time to regulate is the time when it's least needed, right? Exactly. That there's the in some sense regulation is countercyclical. Maybe it's pro-cyclical. I'm trying to figure this out. But just that it's really easy to write new financial regulations when everything's going to hell. But the fact is, people on Wall Street aren't going to take a lot of big bets on risky contracts, CDSs or equities or mortgage bonds because they're really frightened. And I think that, to me, actually, when you look back at like the calm of the 40s and 50s in the markets, most people attribute that to FDR and his magical regulation machine. But it seems more likely to me, in fact, especially if you look at the patterns of these like essentially 30-year waves of financial sort of bubbliness, that all it is just that people for 30 years were really convinced that equities were really dangerous. Right. And when the generation that had lived through the Depression retired, then people stopped being convinced. You got the bubble in the 60s. I don't think we're going to have any of these crises for a while because I think all of the banks are convinced that all of this stuff is really dangerous. And I do think there's some moral hazard problem, but the fact is none of them find this fun. They're all spending most of their time being in hideous danger of like losing their CEO-ship, and maybe more heads should roll just to drive that lesson home. But in general, I think they're probably not going to take nearly as much risk. And in fact, everyone's complaining about the banks don't lend. Well, the banks don't lend because their risk appetite just radically shifted, and that's secular. It's not because of any regulator. They just do not want to take risk, and that's maybe a good thing.
Right. No, it's a great question. I mean, I think you're right. I don't know enough about the kind of longer term effects or maybe the intermediate term effects of the New Deal regulatory regime to know what fraction of the decline in stock market craziness is attributable to the regulatory regime and what fraction is attributable just to a general loss of appetite for risk after the Depression. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's clearly not zero. The latter isn't trivial. I think clearly there was a sort of generationally, a reduced appetite for over the course of a generation, and that the subsiding of that probably did play a role in kind of the subsequent frothiness of the 60s,
well, it's interesting, actually. They do economic, Vernon Smith's team does these experiments with stock markets, and it turns out that you get bubbles in asset markets. They structure them with these assets that have a random payoff that's set between, some like 27 cents to 64 cents or something. And there's a bubble, and you keep getting bubbles until you have the same people play the game over and over again. And the most interesting thing, actually, is that if you introduce new people, the bubbles start again. Because, other people's expectations about the price are a valid thing you need to consider when you sell it. So it's suggestive, and I don't think there's any way to prove it one way or the other. And I certainly think that there are some regulations that are a very good idea. But, I mean, I also think there are regulations that it's really hard to maintain in the face of, like the 2004 decision about capital requirements, leverage ratios for investment banks. They did that because for 20 years nothing bad had happened. How long are they supposed to?
I've actually heard that has been overstated. That everyone talks about. So there used to be like a 12-to-1 leverage ratio that was enforced, and it went up to like 33-to-1 or something. And I've heard that that's actually not true. I know it's been written about a lot. Alan Blinder, I think, wrote about it in one of his columns in the New York Times, and I think the former SEC chief economist wrote. But I think that's actually not. I think it's been overstated a bit. So I think even, I think you could argue that it even proves the point even more, which is that I don't think the regulatory standard officially changed as much, but there just is there's ways around these things sort of informally, and people's general appetite for risk changes, and so these, even if you don't formally change the regulations over time, they do weaken, sort of by attrition and innovation and, just a general sort of complacence, I think, and overconfidence about risk.
I think it's been overstated, but I mean, I definitely think it's been overstated because almost everyone who's commenting on this crisis is kind of like, they're like looking for the unified field theory. And my ham-fisted theory about all of this is that it's just, that at any given time, something's happening, or a couple things, or a few things are happening that could crash the system. And it's only when all of them hit together that you get this spectacular decline, and that's pretty rare. So you get them like once every 60 years or 50 years, or on average. Sometimes they come sooner, sometimes there's a slightly longer stretch. But that, anything that tries to locate some actor or some rule change is going to fail. I mean, and this is good, right? Because God, if our system can actually be brought down by one rule change, then we have a lot bigger problems than either Republicans or Democrats, depending on who you're looking to blame this week, like the CRA or the. Anyway, on to the next topic.
Sure. Yeah. Well, maybe we should do something a little more sort of crass and quotidian. Like the news, I guess that came out late last week, that Larry Summers was actually paid over $5 million by D.E. Shaw, this hedge fund he worked for, after leaving the presidency of Harvard, but before joining the Obama administration. Not surprisingly, it's prompted a lot of hand-wringing and teeth-gnashing and outrage, particularly on the left. Your thoughts? How alarmed should we be at Summers' very lucrative relationship with Wall Street hedge fund?
It makes me uneasy in the sense that, I think I've talked about this on earlier Blogging Heads, but the quote that sums up this whole problem to me really well is from Woody Allen. And he said, I think that my brain is the most important organ, but then look who's telling me that. And I think that you have this real problem with experts, and are experts. Lobbyists are the people who know the most about the topic, because they're the people who've spent the most time. First of all, they know whatever industry that you're regulating, but they also know the policy stuff. And that combination of people who've actually sort of been like deep in the policy process, and also know what the nuts and bolts of whatever industry that you're trying to deal with, like that's really rare. And a lot of people who are like that are lobbyists, and the Obama administration has had to backtrack and say, well, certain kinds of lobbyists are okay, right? So the broader problem, though, is that the people in any situation, the people who know the most about an industry, or the most about a process, are the people who are in that industry, which means that they have vested interests. They have something to gain or lose. And also that just naturally, you come to think that your friends are generally nice people, the people you spend time with. It's a natural human instinct to like the people that you're around, and to therefore think that their view of the world and the things that benefit them has merit. And, it was interesting to me. I dated, I dated a guy in grad school who was a rabid liberal, and he thought that every industry needed to be regulated, except, interestingly enough, investment banking, which is where he ended up. Because, right, and this sounds terrible, except that, in fact, like, he was in investment banking. He could see what the regulators were doing. He could see the screwed up bits, right? He could see the system in a way that me sitting on my couch, any regulation you propose will sound good to me because I'm not going to see how it's going to percolate through. And so, you know, this is the issue. We pull our Treasury secretaries from Wall Street and the regulators because they're the people who know the most about the financial markets. And that's what the Treasury Secretary does most these days. This maybe wasn't true 150 years ago, but it certainly is now. So, but that Treasury Secretary, that, you know, CEA person, you can either have an academic who's never been in the policy sort of mess, or you can have someone who's been in the fray, and that person coming out of the fray is going to bring with him all of his associations about, you know, what he thinks about what's good for Wall Street and what he thinks about the world will have been shaped by that industry. I don't know how you get around that. I mean, I think, like, in terms of what he did after he left office, what Bob Rubin did was way more deeply problematic than what Larry Summers did. But, you know, do we really want only academics who have no connection to Wall Street and have no idea how the thing works? Because, like, they will screw it up. Academics are really, really good at what they do, but they're working with models. They don't know what the actual system looks like. They know what a very, very simplified model of that system looks like. And I think that's a huge tension that we're not going to resolve. There's no real right answer to it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, I think you're right that Obama and the administration was probably a little too puritanical about its view of lobbyists generally. And I think it's clearly cost them in staffing their administration early on. I mean, they would argue that if you look at the transition period, that usually, you know, the period of time in which it takes you to populate your administration with, you know, assistant secretaries and deputy secretaries and undersecretaries, they're not at all out of, you know, the historical norm, and I think that's true. But obviously, they're the first in a generation or two to take office in the middle of such a big crisis. So you would like to think that we could expedite the process a bit,
rather than slowing it down.
Right, but in fact, we're doing the opposite. Right. So yeah, I think Obama made a campaign promise that sounded pretty good and kind of epitomized the symbolism that his candidacy represented. But I think, you know, the reality is not as great as the rhetoric was on the campaign trail. And I would hate to be sort of to hoist on the petard of sort of change rhetoric while the global financial system melts down. So I definitely agree with you that if the chief restraint to this is a promise that he made during the campaign, then he should just eat it and reverse course, and let's get the people who, you know, may in some in some sort of abstract way be compromised. You know, let's not quibble too much. On Summers in particular, I would say a couple of things. One, substantively, I think Summers is actually like the best of all worlds, really. I mean, he made a lot of money, but was actually only at D.E. Shaw for like a day a week, you know? So it seemed like long enough to sort of get a feel for how markets work and how sophisticated investors think about markets and the kinds of deals that they make and the kinds of considerations they make when thinking about a deal, but not like, you know, it wasn't the sort of 80-hour a week, you know, kind of full immersion program that would, you know, really cause you to internalize a lot of the biases, some of them, many of them self-serving, of your colleagues and of your industry. So in that respect, the fact that he made $5 million over 2 years for 1 day a week of service, I find that more encouraging than discouraging. I would prefer that he make the $5 million for 1 day a week than $5 million for 80 hours a week, frankly.
Although I find it discouraging that, in fact, apparently, like, the best way to get really, really rich as an academic is to go into government, so that someone will pay you $5 million to show up once a week and see how things are getting along without you.
It's true, though. I mean, remember at the time, I mean, Summers really didn't think he'd have another shot at going into government after Harvard. I mean, he sort of took the D.E. Shaw gig because he thought, well, I've kind of flamed out at Harvard. I'm a bit of a, you know, I'm a little toxic as a sort of commodity for an incoming administration. I won't worry about the atmospherics here and just I'll just make some money because I haven't made much money over the course of my career. So I think, often these arrangements are kind of, implicit quid pro quos. But in this case, I don't think D.E. Shaw could really bank on a big return from Summers in a future administration because at the time he took the job, it looked like, look, he still had all of his stature from the Treasury years from the first time around. And as this piece in the New York Times today points out, that stature was very valuable to D.E. Shaw. I mean,
Right, I think they were buying his name. I don't think they were buying his connections.
Right.
And, that's kind of the question, I guess. Should former officials be allowed to lend the cachet of their name to the highest bidder? But what are we going to stop it? Are we going to tell them they're not allowed to have any jobs after that's it? You become Treasury Secretary and then you're done, go retire?
Right. Seems very different.
What Bob Rubin did was really troubling. His role at Citigroup.
Was kind of a political fixer.
He called Treasury and tried to fix Enron. That's pretty extraordinary.
No, I agree. It's I think the comparison doesn't serve Rubin well, rather than reflect badly on Summers. The other question in my mind, I think, is sort of the political question. Maybe slightly outside the purview of our discussion, but you have heard a lot of analogies to Daschle, and people are trying to throw that into the White House's face, into Summers' face, and into Obama's face. But I think Daschle actually was more egregious from a political perspective because not only had he become a very wealthy man by being on the payroll of a lot of the companies who would then have interest before him as the country's chief healthcare bureaucrat and the person tasked with overhauling the healthcare system. But on top of which, he didn't pay taxes on the money that, a lot of the money that he received from these interests. And so what did Daschle in is this perception that A, he's a wealthy guy who's made a lot of money from these interests, and B, in addition to being a wealthy guy, he thinks, perhaps because he's a wealthy guy, that he doesn't have to follow the rules that apply to most of us who aren't as wealthy and powerful and as connected. And again, what the Times piece points out is Summers was sort of the opposite, sort of, dotting all his I's and crossing all his T's and paying all his taxes. And I think it's an important distinction because the whole risk with wealth isn't just the wealth and the conflict of interest, such as it is per se. It's the idea that when you become wealthy and powerful, you think you live by a different set of rules that, all of us mere mortals have to abide by, but you do not. And I think, by having not put himself in the Obama administration in that position, he, I think, averts a lot of the political problems that Daschle, risked bringing on to the administration.
I think it's totally bizarre that if you look at the level of the stuff that goes on in Congress, that we're even, was it Dingell who was married to a major GM's lobbyist, right? And he was, now also he was a senator from Michigan, and in fact, he has his interests lie that way anyway. But, or if you look at, do you remember this? The Wall Street Journal a couple years ago published an article on a study that showed that the Senate are the best stock pickers in the entire world.
Right.
And what is it? They're trading on the regulatory knowledge. They know what's going to come up before committee, and they know what's going to happen, and they buy stocks in advance, and they make a ton of money on it, and no one cared. That to me was actually I'm generally pretty cynical, but that really shocked me. And I was really upset by it, and everyone else, whatever. I'm kind of surprised that the Obama administration is taking this much heat for all of this stuff, because we totally ignore it in the Senate.
Well, I think it goes back to the earlier point that, Obama brought some of it on himself with the sort of puritanical rhetoric and the pledges to change Washington. There's nothing that reporters in the White House press corps love more than wrapping campaign rhetoric around a president's neck. It's just like a timeless tradition, right? You said this on the campaign trail, now you appear to be, undercutting it. Why? What changed? Why have you suddenly gone native in this corrupt town that you decried as a candidate?
And I think that this is a good and healthy instinct, because otherwise they'll just promise anything to get elected,
Absolutely,
right? So
I don't disagree. Though I think part of it also, one of the things that you're seeing here, and I think it came out a lot during the AIG bonus scandal, uproar, or whatever, and this time too, is a lot of members of the Washington Press Corps don't have a lot of knowledge about the esoteric financial dealings of these institutions that have suddenly become incredibly important and topical. So they seize on things that they do know, which is like, you are hypocritical, you made a promise and now you're breaking it, or, everyone, these guys who are scuzzy and everyone thinks nearly brought down the global financial system, they just got a lot of bonus money. So, we're really mad about that. But, I think if we had like slightly sophisticated understanding of financial markets and how these institutions work and what the details of the various bailouts and other arrangements that the Treasury and the Fed have made with them, if the average White House reporter understood those a little better, their outrage and their efforts might be a little more, the proportions might be different. I would just say that.
So let's talk about transparency versus populism, because this is a kind of a hot topic right now, right? You've got last week, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, otherwise known as the FASB, changed the rule for mark-to-market accounting. So previously, banks had to write down their mortgage securities. Unless they were going to hold them to maturity, they had to write down the value of their mortgage securities to the market price. And the FASB's relaxed that rule. And this triggered quite a lot of outrage in the blogs and elsewhere. Not entirely unjustifiably. It certainly wasn't a rule that I thought was a great idea. But I think it actually brought up a really important question, which is, and this also comes back to the Fed. A lot of libertarians I know are upset that the Fed is taking this incredibly untransparent role in all of in this mess, right? And in fact, one of the things that has to be explained is that, and I think libertarians often don't see, is that Congress is in favor of this. Congress wants the Fed to do their dirty work because they don't want to pay the political price. And of course, then the libertarians would say, well, they should pay the political price, right? So, but the Fed is doing a lot of dirty work, and it's bad in a couple of ways. It's compromising the independence of the central bank, which I think you and I would probably agree is that's one of those things that I think just everyone who studies economics learns as sort of this deep, you love your mother, you salute the flag, and central bank independence is amazing and awesome. And so it's compromising the independence. It's getting the central bank much more involved in sort of daily political process. And it's also, it is unaccountable. It's doing this massive, they're basically leveraging the Fed's bank balance sheet to do massive fiscal stimulus, but because they're disguising it, right? So it doesn't, because no one pays attention to the Fed's balance sheet, or they don't pay nearly as much attention to the Fed's balance sheet, in part because much of it doesn't really come from taxpayers, it comes from bank fees, that there's this unaccountable, very powerful institution moving around behind the scenes. And that upsets people. But at the same time, when you look at, have you watched any of the hearings?
Yeah, a few here and there, yeah.
Okay, so, when I watch these hearings and I see Maxine Waters open her mouth, I think, thank God for the Fed. Right. Thank God this woman is not in any way substantially involved because she's crazy. Right. And she's not the only one. The general level of complete ignorance on the Financial Services Committee of the institutions who they are supposedly regulating is astonishing.
Right, but it actually doesn't even matter that the representatives themselves are ignorant, right? Because I think most of their constituents are basically ignorant. So even if they had an incredibly sophisticated grasp of these issues, there's no way they could explain it to the people who get up and scream at them at a town hall meeting, right? So they're functionally ignorant, even if they actually have the most sophisticated financial minds you could imagine, right?
Right. So if Congress were actually in charge of this, what we would get, I remember Maxine Waters during the first Paulson-Bernanke appearance, she used her 5 minutes to quiz Paulson about what he was doing for minority and women-owned small businesses. Right. And he was like, well, I'm making their banking system not evaporate. It's just but that's what we would get if we didn't have institutions like the Treasury and the Fed, which are less accountable. Right. Then that's all we would have, right? We would respond to this crisis with a massive program aimed at women and small business, and probably lending to farms and I don't know.
Yeah, I was just saying that this is, in a nutshell, the argument against, among other things, against nationalizing banks, right? I mean, the government-owned Citigroup or Bank of America, you can imagine the Maxine Waters of the world saying, why aren't you investing in this or that noble but probably very poor investment, from a strict returns perspective, rather than seeking out the highest return for the capital that they have to deploy. So you could imagine it very quickly turning into a real fiasco, and I don't begrudge Tim Geithner at all for not wanting to subject, the banks or the country or the financial system to that kind of, quagmire. I think it clearly would be. I think on some level we kind of do need to do this out of the political spotlight. I wrote a profile of Summers a couple of weeks ago, and it was sort of one of the issues I grappled with, and I tried to put it to Summers in the kind of historical example that I used, and Rubin actually writes about this in his memoir, is the bailout of Mexico, which basically, the Mexico in late 94, early 95 suffered a run on its currency, and our Treasury Department concluded that this would be, if Mexico collapsed, be really bad for the U.S. economy, could really dent GDP growth, and it could turn into a general kind of global contagion where capital would depart quickly from a lot of emerging markets, and it would be really bad. And they determined that between us and the IMF, we could probably have a good chance of stopping it. We would need to pitch in maybe $25 billion. The IMF would kick in a roughly equivalent amount. So they took this to the president. The president said, great, good idea, let's do it. Took it to Congress. The leaders of Congress, Newt Gingrich at the time, Bob Dole, Al D'Amato, who is the chairman of the banking committee, initially said, great, do it. Then, the next day they actually go up to Congress, the Financial Service Committee or the Senate Banking Committee, or it might have even been like a big joint, session of both committees to answer questions. And immediately, Rubin and Summers start getting harangued about bailing out their friends on Wall Street. And, it was basically dead in its tracks. There was no way that they were going to get the $25 billion for Congress. And so they eventually had to go to something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was a pot of cash that Congress, I think, established in the 30s when we went off the gold standard effectively to sort of manage exchange rates. Treasury lawyers ruled that they could tap this fund, and so they got the money and bailed Mexico out, and it worked out well. Mexico paid back the loan, several years ahead of schedule. But it clearly would have never happened if it were up to Congress. I mean, or at the very least, it would have been incredibly difficult, and Congress really didn't want to authorize it. I mean, maybe if push came to shove, they would have, but there was every political incentive for them not to, and it looked like that's where it was headed. So I sort of asked Summers about this, and I used that particular example and tried to sort of bring it into the current context. And he, he has to kind of be diplomatic. Obviously, he's still got to deal a lot with Congress, and you, as a high-ranking government official, you never want to say, oh, yeah, it'd be great if we didn't have sort of democratic institutions, it'd be great if I could just, do what I wanted. But he did kind of sort of concede that, that these things can get a little dicey. And I think, I think that's sort of understating it. I really do think that the understanding of these sort of the way in which, global financial markets can impact the general supply of credit, which can in turn the real economy, is so threadbare that the average person sees any attempt to kind of get credit flowing as an attempt to bail out Wall Street fat cats. And if that's the essential dynamic, there's really no way to have this kind of be completely scrutinized in a democratic way and, prevent the global economy from collapsing. I mean, I thank God every day that Ben Bernanke has a lot fewer constraints on his actions, and that he's actually very aggressive. I think, the other risk is that you have you kind of go the other way. You have a non-democratic institution like the Fed, but you have it run by a character who's so sort of in the throes of establishment opinion from 10 years before or a generation before. In this case, a Fed chairman who was so preoccupied with the looming inflation risk, and that if you really pumped a lot of credit into the economy, you might avert this deflationary spiral, but inflation might tick up from 2% to 4 or 5%, when the recovery came. And I think that would be equally devastating. It would
be almost like we had the chairman of the ECB.
Exactly, Trichet, exactly right. So I am both happy that an institution like the Fed exists and is insulated to a large extent from popular opinion, which I think tends to be a really bad influence in situations like this. But I'm also happy, and I'm also aware that kind of lack of democratic responsiveness can be abused and put to really bad uses. And so I really feel grateful that not only we have the institution set up the way it is, but we have someone who's kind of using it for basically the right ends. I mean, you could quibble with the terms of this or that deal, but I think if we had a Trichet kind of character who basically was still really worried about inflation, the world would be a much, much darker place.
Although, to be fair, like many of the citizens of Europe are also really worried about inflation. And maybe the last question to ask is, I mean, what did you think about what came out of the G20?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I had something that was so different from others. I mean, I thought that it's great that they're pouring more money into the IMF. There are a lot of probably small economies that could take a bigger hit and don't have the resources to get through sort of basic liquidity crises that will now be able to prevent a lot of unnecessary suffering basically as a result of that. So that was encouraging. I mean, not exactly a surprise that Europeans argued that they don't want to take additional fiscal stimulus measures for a variety of reasons. One of which is they have shrinking populations, so they don't want to take on a lot of debt, and the memory of hyperinflation in the interwar years looms large, and they already have all these automatic stabilizers who do a lot of the heavy lifting anyway. Whatever. It would have been nice if they committed to more robust stimulus, but that probably just wasn't going to happen. Not bad. I mean, I think Paul Krugman, I think put it well on his blog. More than most, what came out of this was more than most kind of multilateral summits, but certainly not an answer to our prayers by any stretch.
It's really interesting, actually, because I don't know about you, but having been something of a student of past financial crises, both developed world and developing, you always look at these things and you can often see what needs to be done.
Right.
And you say to yourself, why can't they do this? Right. Why,
right.
For example, did Argentina spend itself into a fiscal crisis where they had to blow their dollar peg and put their economy into crisis when everyone knew that their treasurer knew? It wasn't like anyone. And it turns out, looking at all of these policy machinations, suddenly it's easy to see why they didn't do it, why people don't do the obvious thing, because politics doesn't work that way.
Right.
And part of the problem, right, is that all of these people who are railing about bailing out the fat cats are right.
Right.
You can't bail out the banking system without bailing out the bankers. They have it. And there's this really difficult... Malcolm Gladwell wrote a really good article about homelessness about a couple years ago.
The power rule.
Right, where he talked about how you basically got this small number of homeless people.
Right.
They really do behave completely irresponsibly, right? They're addicted to drugs.
Right.
They don't get treatment.
Right.
They won't abide by the rules of homeless shelters, so they can't stay in them because they use drugs and they steal or whatever. And they cause huge problems. They're phenomenally expensive. It's like $1 million a year spent on emergency room services and so forth. But there's not that many of them. Most homeless people are garden variety. They spend a couple nights in the shelter because, mom broke up with her boyfriend and now they don't have anywhere to stay, and, it takes her a while to find an apartment. But so the policy that the Bush administration came up with to deal with these people was just to stop worrying about whether they deserve the money and just give them apartments, and not worry about what they were going to do with them, not make treatment a condition of. And so the net result is you've lost this lever to make them get treatment, but you're saving yourself money. But it violates every moral feeling we have about people deserving help from the community. And it's different if someone's mentally ill, but if someone is sort of choosing to take heroin so that they're unemployable and sleep on the street and get violent with other people in the shelter, it's they're in some sense not deserving of the money, but it costs you more to worry about whether they deserve it, to try to make them reform. What do you do? And that's sort of the thing I think of with the bankers is they probably do need reform, but it would cost a fortune and we wouldn't do it well.
No, I think that's I think it's a great analogy, and I feel like a lot of the criticism of the Geithner plan and sort of non-nationalization plans on the left has been, look, this is just a giveaway to the banks. I think they often confuse and conflate the moral distributional questions with the questions of can it work, And I agree, they're offensive for all the reasons that you suggest in your homeless person analogy. But, you often hear, well, it's just not fair. It's a giveaway to the bankers. I mean, Jeff Sachs had this post on the Huffington Post today, I think, about the ways that the Geithner plan can be gamed, and they can set up these off-balance sheet vehicles and bid on their own assets, and it'll just end up being a straight check directly from the government to the banks. And my first thought was, ooh, that sounds really, really bad. Like, we should stop it. My second thought was, well, that's actually not that bad if it just gets if it achieves the recapitalization that we really want to achieve. Like, yeah, it sucks that we have to sort of give them this check, But on the other hand, like, there are these huge holes in their balance sheets, and they do need capital, and we can't really get it from Congress because Congress doesn't really want to give us more money. So if this is the way we have to do it, as offensive as it is to some of my moral sensibilities, like, yeah, what's the alternative,
I mean, I think part of it too is that, like, I think you're right? Like, and this goes back to transparency, which is that I think that in fact this aspect of just giving money to the banks is the intent of the program,
right.
but because politically they can't just say, like, I'm giving Goldman Sachs $1 billion to play with, and I'm not going to ask them where it went, and I don't want to know. But part of it is, and I went to business school, and a lot of my beloved classmates are bankers, and they really do, like, everyone in that stratum, they feel in this bizarre way entitled to the money. And they feel the illusion is that, in fact, everyone who gets there has worked really, really hard, and they've played by the rules their whole life. These are people they put in 80, 90, 100 hours a week. They've delayed gratification to get phenomenal amounts of education. They worked hard in school. They've done everything they were supposed to. And so they feel like the fact that doing that resulted in this massive payout means that in some sense they deserved it. And in fact, like, there are lots of people out there who work for the post office who played by the rules that were in their community just as, like, assiduously, right? They finished high school and got an associate's degree and did what, like, or whatever, who are making, $50,000 a year. Like, you can't, and so it's grating. It is absolutely, like, beyond anything else, because I actually do think the extent of malfeasance is really exaggerated. My basic take on all of this is that everyone was getting just crappy price signals from the market at the same time, the homeowners and the bankers both. And that it's, when two people go bad, it's stupidity. When, like, the whole system goes bad, it's not because, like, you suddenly just got a bad batch of bankers. Like, something bad happened that no one wanted to happen or expected to happen, and markets do that sometimes. But that, like, the fact that they, during the good times, thought that they had actually made all of this wealth that was falling through their hands, and the fact that they thought that they were entitled to it, makes you so much less want to help them keep any of it. Like, it's not because I think that they're bad, but it does grate that someone thinks that they're supposed to, as, like, a natural right, get a $500,000 a year paycheck when, like, the rest of us manage to struggle on quite well with, like, very small fractions of what they make and lead rich and fulfilling lives. And also some of us, like you and I, worked hard, played by the rules, and went to graduate school. It's just, and I do think that that's a factor. And I personally actually don't care about the size of their paychecks. But I can't help, like everyone else, but think that it would be good for the country if the bankers got over the idea that in some way, like, they and they alone, standing on their Randian mountaintop, like, waving their mighty sword of financial knowledge, made this happen. That said, the problem is that they do in fact have useful knowledge. They don't have nearly as much useful knowledge as they claim to. But they do know how the system works better than, like, it's fascinating to me where people are like, well, these people are really stupid because they lost a lot of money. And it's like, dude, have you looked at your portfolio? Are you really stupid? Like,
No, I agree. And the other thing you hear a lot is, well, do these people really have bargaining power? I mean, there are a lot of unemployed bankers now. Like, why, can't we just easily replace them? If they give us guff, why don't we fire them and hire other bankers? There's plenty of out-of-work bankers. And it, like, totally glossed over the fact that, like, within a bank, there are a lot of, like, extremely specific functions that people perform with extremely narrowly targeted sets of skills, right? So it's like not like you just like take banker A and replace him with unemployed banker B, you know, like if he gives you any lip, you know, like it's the human capital is like extremely, you know, it's a very subtle, narrowly targeted thing, you know.
Well, and also the fact that I think this is because the mystery of finance pay has always been somewhat enduring. And mostly like the mystery of why banks get so much money, because they like flat 7% on every IPO you get. What? Yeah, they co-broke them, but like why is anyone paying banks 7%? What they do is not worth it. I will say that from my lofty position, having spent one summer as a summer associate at Merrill Lynch, but. I did not see any evidence of work that was worth $1 million an hour or whatever outrageous sum they were being paid for it. But the thing is, like, they handle such vast amounts of money that the reason that, like, analysts get paid so much, right, is that when an analyst is dealing with billions of dollars, there might be someone who's 95% as good as he is who's willing to work for, you know, a third of what he gets paid. But a small error will cost you so much more than his salary that it's worth getting into a bidding war over a small pool of talent. And that's why these guys get paid so much, is that their small errors add up into gigantic losses of money.
Yeah, and it's the argument.
They didn't see it that way. None of them saw it as like, well, this is kind of this historical accident. They all saw it as it's like, I'm Thor, the mighty god of the financial markets.
No, I agree. And
anyway,
I mean, there are similar justifications for CEO pay, right? That the multinational companies that they run are so large, and the revenues and profit streams that you're talking about are so enormous that it's worth way overpaying for someone, because frankly, the overpayment is going to be a tiny fraction of the overall profit stream and revenue stream.
Exactly.
So you might as well, the harm that someone could do would be enormous. So, I agree. It's still absolutely maddening, the sense of desert. We saw it with that AIG resignation letter that was published on the Times op-ed page, right? I mean,
and I felt sorry for him because he was promised a payout and he stayed to close up his job. And I thought, like, you don't get someone to work for you 12 hours a day for a year and then just go like, oh, sorry, just kidding. You didn't get paid this year, which is what they were planning to do to him.
It's true.
I would have been mad too.
No matter,
like, the size of the paycheck wasn't so much as like, you don't I don't work for you for a year and then you take my paycheck. That doesn't happen. We don't have slavery in this country. And like, I would have felt just as mad if it were $5,000 as if it were, $700,000, or slash it in half. Like, you agreed to do it, and I agreed to do it on this terms. I gave you full value. You give me what you owed me. But yeah, his sense of like that somehow like he had earned in some like deep metaphysical sense all of this money was troubling, and more so with the other people who were talking about how much they get paid, and they say, well, it really costs a lot to live in London and so forth. And I'm actually really sympathetic to that, because living as an expat is always more expensive. You just don't have like you're not plugged into the local network. But like, I've lived in London for less than $10,000.
Yeah.
No, I didn't have a kid, but like, I don't care. It's possible to do. And like, you're really not going to play on my heartstrings by saying that you have to rent a house for $10,000 a month and you couldn't possibly live in anything less. Like, I lived in a 430 square foot apartment with a dog in New York for 3 years. I don't want to hear it,
Right.
Anyway.
Well, we should maybe wrap it up, I think.
After our own populist ranting.
Exactly. Well, it was great to do this with you.
Yeah, great to talk to you, and look forward to seeing you more around the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Oh, great. Take care.
All right, bye.